An aunt that used to teach there. She taught there her entire life, I think.
At Ilani?
Yeah.
Aloha and good afternoon. My name is Andrew Anchetta. I am a senior and the student body vice president at Chaminade University. I will be your MC for today's program. In the name of the Marianist Center of Hawaiʻi, St. Louis School, and Chaminade University, I would like to welcome you to the Mackey Catholicism in Prophetic Dialogue. We are now celebrating the 25th anniversary of this program. As you may know, this lecture series is named after Father Robert Mackey, founder and first president of Chaminade University. Father Mackey was an important voice in the civic and religious community of Honolulu. He was an unfailing advocate for the poor and the marginalized in Hawaii and in the world. This lecture series was created 25 years ago to continue the influence of his presence. The Mackey Lectures are a unique event on the campus calendar in that they are one of the few programs jointly sponsored by all three institutions on the Kalaipohaku campus, namely the Marianist Center of Hawaii, St. Louis School, and Chaminade University of Honolulu. And for that reason, it is with even greater pride that I welcome you today. As you can see, the format of the Mackey Lecture has been adapted due to the coronavirus pandemic. This program is being recorded on Monday, October 5th, 2020, and will have its premiere on YouTube on Sunday, October 11th, 2020, on the Marianist Center of Hawaii's YouTube channel. Today's program, Racism in Hawaii, a Faith Response, is a Zoom presentation in which our speaker, Father Alapaki Kim, will make a presentation. A group of selected faculty, staff, and student participants from Chaminade University and St. Louis School are attending this Zoom. They will be listening to the presentation live. They will then meet in small groups to come up with timely questions for the presenter. The video continues when these questions will be presented to Father Alapaki so that he might share more of his wisdom with us. I would now like to introduce the Marianist Lay Community member, Kapono Ryan, who will lead our opening prayer.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Hiakua, creator of the universe, creator of all life, who has gifted us with each other and this earth to share as our home, please hear our prayer. We are facing a difficult time of reckoning. We wrestle with issues concerning the dignity of life. We are in conflict over deep racial, ethnic, social, and cultural divides, causing generational trauma year in and year out. Many are angry. Some are laissez-faire. Others are paralyzed by the complexities. All of us have our personal ignorances and arrogances. Forgive us. But we need discernment and understanding. We know your ways are not our ways. We know your thoughts are not our thoughts. So we humbly ask for your mercy and for discernment and understanding and wisdom. May this session awaken in us a new way, such a way that we can respond to each other with greater humility and greater love. And we ask this once again in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Kapono. I would now like to introduce Brother Dennis Schmitz, Director of Special Ministries for the Marianist Center of Hawaii, to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Andrew. I first came to Hawaii back in the 60s as a young brother, and I was a student here. And it was a very interesting time, but it was not at all like what it was when I came back. And as I've come back to Hawaii 25 years later to minister, there's been the whole reawakening of Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian language and so forth. And so when I came back, I started, this is back in the mid-90s, and I started going over to the Big Island for Bilac. And when I went there, there was this priest who has a very imposing figure with big hair and a big loving personality, and most importantly, a big heart. And he was very much into the culture, and he was able to share with us, especially over the years, about Hawaii, about the people, about what has happened here. And he could share it in terms of personal experiences of his family, also from his own studies and from his own religious training. And so he brings that all together. And so it really is with great pleasure that we have him here with us today. And so I would like to welcome Father Alapaki Kim, who will begin his presentation now. Father Paki.
Mahalo. Usually I would begin with my genealogy, but that'll take too long. So we'll just say I'm half Korean, half Hawaiian. My Korean side, my grandfather came on the first boat here to Hawaii in 1906. He went to Koloa on Kauai, where he worked in the pineapple fields. He worked there for the rest of his life, eventually moving to Ewa and Ewa Plantation. My grandmother was a mail order bride. My grandfather's family in Korea was not very honest. They showed a picture of him that was 25 years old. So when she got off the boat, everybody else found their partners, and there was just this one old man there. And she says when she realized that was him, she wanted to get on the boat and go back to Korea. Well, thank God she didn't, because they had 8 kids. One of them was my father. My mother's side is Native Hawaiian. My mother was born in Kaupo on Maui. Her family goes back generations in Kaupo and also on Hawaii Island. So we've got ties to both islands. So that's what I'll say about them. If we can move to the introduction. You know, in the United States, it's not just people of color. Not just people of color who have suffered racism. Different groups did. The Irish did when they first came. The Italians did, the Jews did. Of course, we know the Chinese came to build the railroad. In California, Chinese children were not able to receive an education until an order of priests and nuns violated the law in San Francisco. The law had to change, or they had to arrest the priests and nuns. And so they changed the law, and that's what allowed Chinese children to receive an education. And of course, we know of the Japanese incarceration during World War II, where they lost everything and had to go to these concentration camps. Probably the 2 worst treated people were Native Americans and African Americans. Native Americans lost their land, lost their culture. Acts of genocide were done against them. Even up till recently, we had the protest at the Dakota Access Pipeline, where 15,000 people were demonstrating, many of them Native Americans. And they were met with tear gas and rubber bullets. In the winter, when it was 25 below zero, they were sprayed with water by North Dakota authorities. Eventually, the pipeline was built. And unfortunately, since the pipeline was built, it has leaked 203 times, spilling 3,406 barrels of crude oil. That's 143,100 US gallons of crude, which polluted the land and drinking water. People hired to work on this were not from the Sioux reservations. They were other people. And since that has happened, the Standing Rock Reservation has had many women who were raped or even disappear due to the building of this pipeline. You know, so it's easy to see racism in other places, but it's really difficult to understand when it's here at home. if we don't have the same experiences, we have a hard time understanding. What I'd like to do is, if we can change the slide to number 4. I forgot to tell you to change the slide. So you can change the slide. Okay, change it. Nope, back one. There you go. So, for example, I'll use Mauna Kea. Why are Hawaiians protesting the 3-meter telescope? You know, when you look at telescopes, they advance the knowledge of humanity. The 3-meter telescope, people say it will employ people from Hawaii. They say that they'll reserve times for Hawaii students. They say that they will train and encourage Hawaii students to pursue careers in astronomy. And they also claim that millions of dollars will be brought to Hawaii. But from the eyes of many Hawaiians, the top of Mauna Kea, much of it is sacred. It is the home of 3 different Hawaiian goddesses. And yes, I am a Catholic priest, but we need to respect other people's religions. It contains heiau, it contains burial sites, it contains archaeological sites. There were villages up there because the best basalt in Hawaii was mined from Mauna Kea. You can find Mauna Kea adzes with made out of basalt on all the different islands. It was the best basalt. Also, what people don't understand is that Mauna Kea, the top, is Hawaiian homelands. Therefore, Hawaiians have a vested interest in what happens up there. Being that the entire top of Mauna Kea is Hawaiian homelands, they should be consulted on the building of the different telescopes. They were consulted on the very first one. The next 12, they were not consulted. The university promised to be good stewards of the Aina, but construction waste after the building of many of those telescopes laid up there for years until lawsuits forced them to take down the construction waste. Human waste and other waste was left up there for years, and another lawsuit was filed. Mind you, this is sacred land. There is so much waste up there that it took helicopters 2 days to remove it. There have been chemical spills, mercury and hydraulic fuel mostly. They have not yet been cleaned up, and they were spilt years ago. The university promised that they would, Malama the Aina, take care of the land, but their promises were empty. They totally disrespected the Aina, of which the Hawaiians consider sacred. Even though the university says that they will do a better job, there is nothing to say that they will. TMT also threatened that if they could not start construction, that they would move to the Canary Islands. And they would take all the jobs, all the knowledge, and the millions of dollars away from Hawaii. I think many Hawaiians view this as a lie because they are still here. To the Hawaiians, they had no intention of moving to the Canary Islands. They made the threat so as to force the hand of the state of Hawaii to remove the protesters, mostly Native Hawaiians. And so to the Hawaiian people, the TMT people seem to be very disingenuous. Now the TMT is asking the federal government for $100+ million to assist them in construction. They have no intention of moving to the Canary Islands. If we could move to racism and racism against Hawaiians. There you go. Like most people who suffer from racism, history plays an important part of the equation. First of all, Hawaii's first constitution was from 1843. The British had seized Hawaii, and eventually Admiral Thomas came and released Hawaii and recognized Kauikeaʻuli, Kamehameha III, as the legitimate sovereign of Hawaii. He ended up making a constitution And in the Constitution was also what they call the Great Mahele, which was a division of land. What happened, though, was Hawaiian tenure of land tenure was very much different than European land tenure. Hawaiians did not own land. They believed that the land was their grandmother. How can you own or buy and sell your grandmother? And so when the Mahele came out, Hawaiians did not go after the land, most of them. But eventually they had to make a law allowing Hawaiians to live on government lands and crown lands. And I'll talk about that later. So this constitution lasted until 1887. Now, in the meantime, the United States recognized Hawaii, and they formed, they had a treaty with them, and they had what they call the Reciprocity Treaty, where Hawaiian goods could enter into the United States for free. So pineapple and sugar could enter into the US duty-free. Well, after a 5-year period, that treaty came to an end. And in the meantime, the United States reconnoitered Hawaii to find if there was a place that would be of interest to the United States. General Schofield came and reconnoitered in Hawaii, and he said that the Pearl River Lagoon looked to be a very good place for a base. So when the new treaty came up for renewal, that was a part of the treaty. King Kalakaua, who was king at the time, refused to allow Hawaii to be occupied by a foreign country. And this caused the first coup d'etat, which eventually forced the king at gunpoint to sign what they call the Bayonet Constitution. That was on the 6th of July in 1887. What had happened was a group of American European landowners organized a paramilitary group called the Hawaiian Rifles, and they ostensibly to protect the kingdom. But what happened was when there was a threat that the treaty wasn't going to go through, they invaded the palace and held the king at gunpoint till he signed. Princess Liliuokalani, the younger sister of Kalakaua, believed that if her brother did not sign this treaty, he would have been killed. So when he signed the Bayonet Constitution, what it did was it took the power away from the king, and it took the power away from the Hawaiian people. Because what they did was it granted suffrage to foreigners by restricting the vote to only those who owned land and had a certain amount of money in the bank. Most Hawaiians did not own land, and most of the Hawaiians did not have a bank account. Citizenship was not a prerequisite to vote. It also made the House of Nobles, which is the second house, the upper house of the Hawaiian legislature, a voting, something that was voted for. Prior to that, the king appointed people, nobles, ali'i, to be a part of the House of Nobles. But from that point on, it was an elected position. So the foreigners controlled both houses of the Hawaiian Parliament. And then part of the Constitution also said that there would be a cabinet formed. The cabinet would have 3 people from the King's Privy Council, and the rest would be the ministers of the country. And these ministers were also appointed by the House of Nobles. The king could not declare anything on his own. He had to have the approval of the cabinet. And the cabinet could tell the king to sign anything into law. So not only are the people of Hawaii disenfranchised, the king is also disenfranchised. The Hawaiians always hated this constitution. And so later on, Kalakaua, he dies in 1891 and is succeeded by his sister Liliuokalani. Now Liliuokalani was a very powerful woman. She was strong. She didn't take guff off of anybody, and the plantation owners hated her. So in Hawaii, the monarchs are a little different. The modern monarchs of Hawaii were very much different than European monarchs in that the common people had access to them. So one day, a group of people from Hawaii petitioned the Queen to make a new constitution. So she went to her cabinet to ask, and her cabinet agreed. And so she came up to the balcony of the palace and announced that they would have a new constitution. Now, at that time, the American ambassador, it wasn't really an ambassador, he was minister plenipotentiary. It's like one step below an ambassador. His name was John L. Stevens, was appointed in 1891 to Hawaii. Before he left Washington, he bragged that he was going to make Hawaii US. He was an expansionist, along with the Secretary of State, who was David Blaine, and President Harrison at the time. So when the Queen went up to the balcony, he pulled aside all the ministers and threatened them. And so they changed their decision, which forced the Queen to go up to the balcony again to announce to the people that there would be no constitution. But that sent everything into motion. John L. Stevens had Marines landed from the USS Boston. There are in record recorded notes and letters that if John L. Stevens did not succeed, that the Boston would go around Hawaii shelling Hawaiian cities until Hawaii capitulated. But because the Queen fell, they didn't have to do this. So they landed these Marines in, and they said ostensibly to protect American lives. The Americans lived in Nu'uanu. They did not march to Nu'uanu. They marched to the government building, the Ali'olani Hale, and they seized that building. And then they pointed their Gatling guns across the street to the palace. The Queen, upon seeing this, surrendered, but she did not surrender to the Committee of Safety, which were kind of like to say that it was these people that caused the revolution. But she surrendered to the United States under protest. Now, international law says that when there's a surrender under protest, nothing can change in the country except the occupation. After she surrendered, by this time, when she surrendered, it was late in Harrison's presidency, and he submitted the Treaty of Annexation to Congress, but they didn't have time to vote. When Grover Cleveland became president, he withdrew the treaty, and he sent, I'm running into he sent James Blunt in to investigate why she surrendered. And in the meantime, he agreed that if any Hawaiian had violated a law, that they would be tried by US military court using Hawaiian Kingdom law until such time as the Queen is restored. So in the investigation by James Blunt, he never interviewed anyone from the Committee of Safety or John L. Stevens, the American minister. But what he did do is he included hundreds and hundreds of pages of their correspondence with each other, with the United States, so he felt he didn't have to interview them because everything was there. What they had written back and forth between the Committee of Safety and Blunt, and what Blunt wrote President to James Blaine, the Secretary of State, and different people in the United States. He did interview the Royalists, and this is where he found out what had happened between John Stevens and the ministers when he forced them to rescind their consideration for the new constitution. The end, the Secretary of State eventually changed by the time they got the reinvestigation. It was Walter Gresham, and he received the result of the investigation, and he called for the restoration of the kingdom. Cleveland addressed Congress and orders the restoration of the Queen. He called it that the United States, through an act of war, overthrew a friendly, albeit feeble, nation. And he ordered Sanford Ballard Dole, who is the head of the Committee of Safety, to restore the Queen back into power. Sanford Ballard Dole's response was, the US is interfering in the internal affairs of Hawaii, and refused to restore the Queen. The US public was also against the Queen, because, you know, when what was presented to them was that she was like a dictator, and like almost like a pagan type of dictator. And so, and the ones who overthrew her were Americans, so they wouldn't go against it. So so Cleveland had his hands tied behind his back. Now, most of the letters that John L. Stevens and the Committee of Safety wrote to the US were really not truthful. They said that the people were behind them. The people were never behind them. And they later find that out when they get what they call the monster petition. On the 26th of February, 1894, Senator John Tyler Morgan does another investigation. Kai Kendall says it wasn't really an investigation. He says it was an apologetic. But Senator Morgan was a Democrat. Democrats were not expansionists, but Senator Morgan was. He was from Alabama, and he is famous for his Jim Crow stance. And what he saw in Hawaii was a place where he could send African Americans from Alabama to Hawaii for a different homeland, to take them out of Alabama. So he picked the people who were going to be on this committee, and it was people who were sympathetic with him. Now, the only vote that they had that was positive was a 9-0 vote exonerating the USS Boston and the Marine landings. All the rest of them came down to the 4 Republicans and the 4 Democrats voting against each other, with Senator Morgan doing the extra vote. In this investigation, Senator Morgan used the term Kanaka to refer to Hawaiians. And at that time, just the word Kanaka in itself was considered derogatory. It was derived from the Hawaiian Kanaka Uiwi or the Kanaka Maoli for persons of Hawaiian descent. Many Hawaiians considered this white appropriation of the term to be a racial slur. The use of the word Kanaka in the report allowed Morgan to redefine the term Hawaiian to refer only to the geographical rather than the historical inhabitants, thus creating a literary deceit that disassociated Hawaiians from Hawaii, another form of disenfranchisement. It wasn't until this past year that Senator Brian Schatz had this changed in Congress. So now Hawaiians refer to the native people of Hawaii, and everyone else is a Hawaiian resident. With the passage of the Morgan Report, the total disenfranchisement of the Hawaiian people and subjects of the kingdom was completed. Cleveland had his hands tied behind his back, and so he could do nothing but accept the Morgan Report. The Republic of Hawaii was established on July 4th, 1894. They specifically waited for July 4th because it's the American Independence Day. When they when they were planning on the republic, they had a constitutional convention. But in the constitutional convention, no Asians were allowed to participate, even though many of them were Hawaiian subjects. No Portuguese were allowed to participate, even though the Portuguese supported, many of the Portuguese supported the Committee of Safety. And Hawaiians could participate, but they had to publicly renounce their support of Queen Liliuokalani. Not one Hawaiian voted. Out of a population of over 100,000 people, less than 2,000 were allowed to elect people for this constitutional convention. The Constitution for the Republic of Hawaii makes teaching, eventually was ratified and made teaching in the Hawaiian language and teaching of the Hawaiian language to be illegal. At that time, Hawaii was the most literate nation on the earth. Well over 90% of the population read and wrote their own language. At the same time, less than 60% of Americans were literate. But they were afraid that Hawaiians would pass anti-American propaganda through word of mouth. So they banned the teaching of the language and the teaching in the language. They never banned the language speaking, though. You could still speak the language. Ultimately, after a few generations, Hawaiians were reduced from being the most literate people on the face of the earth to the lowest educated in Hawaii. The Republic also seized all government lands. Hawaiians were allowed to live on government lands from the 1843 Constitution. Ancestors lived prior to the coming of Captain Cook, and they were allowed to live there in perpetuity. The Republic of Hawaii, after seizing government lands, began to evict Hawaiians from their traditional lands. The annexation. In the United States, the Constitution, an annexation is an international treaty. Treaties are signed by two heads of state, and treaties need to be ratified after the signing by 2/3 of the Senate. The Hawaii Annexation Treaty failed to be ratified by the Senate 3 times, once in 1894, and twice in 1897. The 1897 failure was due to 2 monster petitions that were signed by 95% of the people of Hawaii that Congress had. And so they refused to sign the treaty. Now, according to the United States Constitution, resolutions are binding only domestically and does not constitute international law. Congress does not have the power to make international treaties. Therefore, Congress does not have the power to annex foreign lands. Hawaii was annexed by the Newlands Resolution. So in that, the United States violated its own constitution. There was no plebiscite in Hawaii because they already had the monster petitions, and they knew that 95% of the people of Hawaii did not want annexation. And even between 1894 and 1896, 2 US senators came to Hawaii believing that the people supported annexation. And when they came home, both of them remarked that the Republic of Hawaii was a government without a people. What John L. Stevens and the Committee of Safety said in their communiques to the US about the popular rebellion was false. The Blunt report contained all the communication between Stevens and the Committee of Safety to the US Secretary of State Blaine, to the President, and responses. America at this point thought that the overthrow was popular in the kingdom and that it was the people who overthrew the Queen, which is still implied today. It was really not the people. The Blunt report said that if it wasn't for the landing of the United States Marines and the USS Boston in Honolulu Harbor, the overthrow would have never happened. Now, people now say that, well, see, Texas is a precedent for Congress admitting foreign countries because Texas was a foreign nation. However, Texas was never annexed by the United States. Congress does have the power to make a state, and Texas was made a state. And then a plebiscite was given to the people of Texas to vote on whether they wanted to accept that or not. And they voted to accept that. That is how Texas became part of the United States. The United States, in annexing Hawaii, continued the ban of the teaching of the Hawaiian language and teaching in the Hawaiian language. Hawaiians go from the most literate people on the face of the earth to the lowest, or near the lowest in all educational statistics. Hawaiian people go from 100% speakers of their own language in 1898 to 1,700 in 1978, when the language was finally lifted. My mother, when she went to school, my mother went to school in the 1920s. She only spoke Hawaiian. Her family only spoke Hawaiian. So, but she skipped kindergarten. And so when she went to grade 1, she and her cousin both entered at the same time. And they were out in the playground in the Kaupo school. And they were speaking in flagpole, did whatever they were supposed to do in front of the flagpole. And then the teachers called my mother and her cousin up. And they started to call them ignorant and stupid in front of all the kids. Hawaiians at that time were not rugged individualists. They did not like to be singled out for either praise or to be chastised. And so when they did this, my mother was horrified. And then they began to beat the 2 girls in front of the whole school. That so affected my mother that decades later, when my nephew Kapele was in Punanaleo, he would talk to my mother in Hawaiian and she would answer back in English. She wouldn't speak to him in Hawaiian. The only time I ever heard my mother speak to us in Hawaiian was when we were in public and she didn't want other people to know, or if she was angry and we were alone. That was the only time I ever heard my mother speak Hawaiian. She was so traumatized by that experience. The US continues the seizure of the Crown lands, which were the private property of Liliuokalani. They seized the government lands, but they also seized the Crown lands. Now, the Crown lands of Liliuokalani were bought by Kalakaua and Liliuokalani. They weren't just given that land for anything. It was their private land. And on these lands, Hawaiians lived. Now, the only Crown lands that were just actually proclaimed Crown lands were what is now known as the Bishop Estate, the Kamehameha from the Kamehameha dynasty. But these were not seized, as the Kamehameha dynasty was not the ruling dynasty at the time of annexation. And the owner of the estate at the time was Charles Reed Bishop, a white man from New York. Hawaiians living on seized Crown lands and government lands were again evicted. In acts of ethnocide, Hawaiian society was not only disrupted, but their customs, their culture, their family units were destroyed. The seizure of both government and Crown lands, Hawaiians lose water rights. Most streams are redirected to water the white-owned pineapple and sugar plantations. Later, these were channeled to water golf courses and other tourist industry facilities. With the streams drying up, it became impossible to grow kalo, the staple of the Hawaiians. Poi, along with most Hawaiian foods, are now considered luxury foods. Rice you can buy for $25, you can buy a 50-pound bag. Potatoes for $4, you can buy a 10-pound bag. Poi is $18 for 3 pounds. And evictions are still happening. When I lived on the Big Island in 1995, there was a family, they were called the Pai Ohana, who lived in South Kona. They lived on that land, their ancestors lived on that land from before the time of Captain Cook. And it eventually became Hawaiian Kingdom government lands, but they were allowed to live on it by the Hawaiian Constitution. And so eventually, these lands became part of the ceded land trust, which came under the jurisdiction of the DLNR, which is now the BLNR. And they found the deed and they gave it to the national park. The national park came in and told the Paʻohana that they could not, what they could and could not do on the land. The Paʻohana had lo'i kalo, where they grew kalo. They also had a lokoi'a, which is a fish pond where they raised fish for food. The National Park Service said they could no longer do that. Of course, they disobeyed because that's where their food came from. Eventually, the DLNR police came in riot gear and evicted the family. Now the National Park Service brings tourists to the site to show them how Hawaiians used to live. Due to the way government lands and crown lands were seized, Hawaii is the only state in the United States where perfect title or proof of legal passing of the lands only goes back 50 years. Everyone else goes back way far. And when the Republic and the US seized these lands, they totaled over 2 million acres. And there was no legal transfer of these titles. Therefore, perfect title cannot go as far back. Hawaiians lost their country. Hawaiians lost their land. Hawaiians lost their language. Hawaiians lost much of their culture, their identity, their family structure. Hawaiians lost their education system, a system that the Kingdom of Hawaii had was the most literate country in the world. The Hawaiians lost the ability to produce their own food. Now, I want to quote quotes from a document called The Church and Racism Towards a More Fraternal Society. It was put out by the Pontifical Commission on Justice and Peace, or Justitia et Pax. In number 8, it says, the forms of racism today. And it says, certain groups of persons whose physical appearance or ethnic, cultural, or religious characteristics are different from those of the dominant group and are interpreted by the latter as being signs of an innate or definitive inferiority, thereby justifying all discriminatory practices in their regard. If in fact race defines a human group in terms of immutable and hereditary physical traits, racist prejudice, which dictates racist behavior, can be applied by extension with equally negative effects to all persons whose ethnic origins, language, religion, or customs make them appear different. Oh, actually, I didn't have to read that, I'm sorry. So, in the Americanization of the Hawaiian people, they tried to cut out the education, the language, the culture. So much so that Kamehameha Schools, which is a Hawaiian school, it was formed by Princess Bernice Pauahi for the education of Hawaiian people. Until the latter part of the 20th century, their students were not trained to work in corporations. They weren't trained to be CEOs. They were trained to be maids and laborers. Some could work as police or firemen, but they would never gain high rank. The teaching of the Hawaiian language was forbidden at the time, because no school in Hawaii taught in Hawaiian or taught the Hawaiian language until after 1978. And it wasn't until recently that in the 2000s that I think Kamehameha made it, started to teach all their students Hawaiian. My mother's treatment made her not want her children to speak Hawaiian. My grandmother was the one that taught us Hawaiian. After a while, I think after my mother, she got angry that she couldn't speak her language. So she would come over to our house and stay for a while, and she would make us speak Hawaiian. She would speak to us in Hawaiian and everything. But when my mother, because Hawaiian culture, you do not say no in those days. You do not say no to your parents. She would just sit there very quietly. But as soon as my grandmother would leave, she would look at us and she'd say, "You don't talk that, it's bad luck." Even recently, I experienced discriminatory behavior. One time, my sister and I, it was in the early 2000s, we were at a cinema in Kailua. And we were just chatting with each other in Hawaiian. We're waiting in line for popcorn. And in front of us was a Caucasian woman. And as we're talking, she just turns around and she looks at us and she yells at us. She says, "This is America, speak English." What made her feel so entitled to treat us as if we were children? What made her feel so entitled that she felt qualified to yell at adults who are way older than she was? What made her so angry? She was not a part of our conversation. We didn't even know her. What gave her the right to verbally insult and abuse us for speaking the mother tongue of this land? Racism, that's what it is, and entitlement. Can we move to the next one? The most obvious forms of racism, okay. So the most obvious forms of racism in the strictest sense of the word is to be found in institutionalized racism. So you can read that. I think institutionalized racism and environmental racism often go hand in hand. Did you know that all the landfills on Oahu are in Nanakuli? A few years ago, there was a study to see where they could put a new landfill, because as the present one was filling up, actually not filling up because it's on the side of a hill. They put the stuff on the side of the hill and then put dirt over it on the hill. If we ever get a huge flood, that's all going to wash down into the sea. So many places were identified around the islands, but eventually all were taken up except those in the Moku of Waianae, the district of Waianae. Kailua, when I lived there, used to have a landfill at Kapa'a Quarry, and that was one of the choices. That could still be used, the site, but this site was dismissed. And the reason why it was dismissed, because it was too close to the Kauai Nui wetlands. And the people in Kailua had the money to litigate. There is no law defining a buffer zone between landfills and homes. One landfill in Nanakuli abuts people's backyards. This landfill that wants to expand to go behind the Sack and Save, that's our largest grocery store. There are also people living there. This proposed landfill will abut those houses. It seems that the wetlands seem to be more important than the people of Waianae. If the landfill is too close to the wetlands because of what it could do, but right behind the homes of people in Nanakuli, it is not right to put the landfill in Kapa'a because of its proximity to the wetlands, but it is okay to put it in Nanakuli, abutting people's backyards and our largest supermarket. Okay, many people, we can move on to the next slide. Many people are relegated to homelands which are hardly capable of self-sustaining and are more over economically and politically dependent on the central power. In Hawaii, the Ahupua'a was the land division, which stretched from the mountains to the sea. The land was looked upon as our grandmother. If one took care of one's grandmother, our grandmother would feed us. People who lived on this land depended on each other, and most were related. Each section of the Ahupua'a was responsible for producing different kinds of food, building material, tools, which was shared among all the people of the Ahupua'a. People were ohana and relied on each other. There was no such thing as rugged individualists in Hawaiian society. People lived and worked as a community. Community was important. It's so important that everyone smoothly cooperated, that ho'oponopono was developed to end division and to foster cooperation. Cooperation is how people survived. They knew what their kuleana, their responsibility was. People who were born on the land, they called the land the onehanau, the sands of their birth. Their ancestors' bones rested in the lands, and therefore for them, their ancestors were very much alive, helping them, guiding them, protecting them. People were related to just about everyone else who lived on the Ahupua'a, and also to the land itself. There was a tie to the ancestors on the land as their bones were there. With the seizure of the government and crown lands, many were evicted. This was the breakup of the entire Hawaiian system. Families were forced to leave the land of their ancestors, the lands that gave them life, thereby separating Ohana. In 1921, Prince Jonakuhio Kalani Anaole was our non-voting representative in the US Congress. And he went to get Hawaiian homelands established because he saw that Hawaiians were losing their culture. And he wanted land set aside so that the Hawaiians could continue to live in their culture and their lifestyle and be protected. Unfortunately, Hawaiian homelands did not develop like Prince Kuhio envisioned. 300,000 acres were set aside, and immediately the large pineapple and sugar barons took 100,000 acres of the best, most fertile lands for themselves. That which was left over was dry, rocky land that was very difficult to farm. Just look on Oahu, Waimanalo. It's dry and it's rocky. Papakolea was hilly and rocky, and it was considered worthless, fit for Hawaiians to live on, but no one else. However, when the city of Honolulu grew with its proximity to Papakolea, Papakolea became valuable, and there was an attempt to move Hawaiians out, but that failed. Nanakuli is an extremely dry area of Oahu. It always has had a lack of water. Hence, it was always poor, even before Western contact, but that's where they have a large Hawaiian homelands. I don't know if you know the story of how Nanakuli got its name. In ancient Hawaii, hospitality was not only a sign of civilized behavior, hospitality was the law. When the Malihini came by, you were supposed to stop everything and offer them something to eat, give them hospitality. If it was coming close to evening, they got the best places in the house to sleep. So when the Malihini would come around to Nanakuli, the people were so poor, they had nothing to offer. So the Malihini would say, hui, aloha. And the people of Nanakuli would do one of two things. They would look off into the distance as if they did not hear, or they would look to the ground out of shame. Nana is to look. Kuli means without speaking. Kuli could also mean knees, so to look at your knees. So when the people got to Waianae, where there was water, and they would say, what's wrong with these people over there? And they would be explained that the people there were very, very poor because of the lack of water. Well, Nanakuli now is Hawaiian homelands. And Waianae, where they do have Hawaiian homelands, is back in the valley, and all the streams had been redirected. So it's very dry and rocky and hot. And Hawaiians were moved onto this land from all over. Most had no familial ties with each other, therefore no connection. With no connection, there was no cooperation. Hawaiian customary relationships of living in the Ahupua could not be duplicated on Hawaiian homelands. The communal parts of the culture that helped Hawaiians survive began to die. The US defined Hawaiians as being 50% blood quantum in an artificial definition of who is Hawaiian and who could live on the land. This further was a further act of ethnocide, separating Hawaiian people. Hawaiians looked at anyone with Hawaiian blood as Hawaiian, and Hanai children who did not have blood were considered Hawaiian too. But now you have 50% and less than 50%. If you were 49% or less, you were considered part Hawaiian and you were not qualified for the land. The blood quantum further caused division in the Hawaiian people, not to mention division in families between the 50% blood quantum and the less than 50% blood quantum. The US firmly believed that since the Hawaiian population had been decimated, it would not be long before no one qualified for the land and the US could reabsorb the land. This obviously has not happened. Changing rules and changes in Hawaiian homelands. When Prince Kuhio established Hawaiian homelands, he established them so that Hawaiians could try to continue to live in their culture in the way they always lived. But it's changed so much that places like in Kapolei, there are restrictions on Hawaiian homelands. And in some places, houses were limited to only 6 people per household. There's this one time I went to court to watch a court procedure because a man's wife had died. They had 4 children. He eventually gets into a relationship with a girlfriend, and she gets pregnant and has a baby. So now there are 7 people in a house that Hawaiian Homeland says only 6 people can live in. The family is placed in a situation where there are 7 people in the house, and Hawaiian Homelands tries to evict the woman. She just has a newborn baby. They force the neighbors of this family to allow surveillance. They put cameras on all homes around so that they could get evidence of eviction. Eventually, they were evicted, but the family takes Hawaiian Homelands to court, and Judge Mulway ruled in favor of the family. Originally, to live in the Hawaiian lifestyle, Hawaiians had pigs, they had chickens. They're part and parcel of the family's food. They had lo'ikalo, they had lokoi'a. In Kapolei, livestock is now forbidden. Hawaiian Homeland neighborhoods are now like suburban Los Angeles. Hawaiian Homelands has become a place for cheap housing rather than the protection of cultural identity and a way of life. Hawaiian Homelands are used for other purposes other than Hawaiian housing. Today, there are many non-Hawaiian entities occupying Hawaiian Homelands, such as military installations, shopping centers, airports, schools, university, telescopes. Monies earned from this rent goes into the governor's general fund, and it does not go into Hawaiian Homelands. Many of the non-Hawaiian entities pay only $1 a year for rent, like the military installations or the telescopes on top of Mauna Kea, schools and universities. In 1994, UH Hilo, who pays $1 rent for the Hawaiian Homelands that they occupy, decided to take away some of the scholarships earmarked for Native Hawaiians and also some of the monies for Hawaiian studies in order to increase the amount of scholarships to foreign Pacific Islanders so that they could come to UH Hilo. There was a demonstration that ensued where the Chancellor's office was occupied until these monies were restored. There is still much underdeveloped Hawaiian homelands, such as on the island of Hawaii. Hawaiian homelands have more requirements as to building homes than non-Hawaiian homelands. When I lived on Hawaii Island, there were and are still many homes that have water catchment. They have no piped in water, they have water catchment. And there are some homes that have no electricity. They rely on gas or on solar for their energy. There are 30,000 families still awaiting to be awarded Hawaiian homelands. I have an aunt, my Auntie Kanoi, pure Hawaiian. She applied for Hawaiian homelands in the 1940s. She was finally offered Hawaiian homelands in the 1990s. She was an old woman by that time. She had no money. She was very poor. So she didn't want to lose it, so she offered it to my cousin Lloyd, who lives in Waianae, but Lloyd didn't have money either. So my aunt was again put on the bottom of the list. She died without ever getting Hawaiian homelands. The largest number of homeless of any ethnic group in Hawaii are Native Hawaiians. Because of Hawaiian homelands, Hawaiians consider themselves not homeless, but houseless, because the land is there and it's available, but they're not allowed to build their homes. The United States military, a lot of their land is on Hawaiian homelands or DLNR lands. During World War II, they seized Kaho'olawe, Waikane, and Makua valleys, and said that after the war, these lands would be returned. Kaho'olawe was returned only after Hawaiians occupied the island I believe it was the 1970s. The island still is loaded with heaps of unexploded ordnance. The island's water table is cracked, so the island is dry. The island's topsoil has been blown away by years of bombing. The Navy was supposed to clean up the mess, but they never did completely clean it up. And it's as it is today. Waikani, there were so many unexploded ordnance that the military now will not use it anymore for training as it deems it too dangerous. Makua is still occupied. There used to be a village there with houses, churches, cemetery. They have all been destroyed because of target practice. Pohakuloa, the lease runs out in 2029. The state was supposed to inspect for environmental reasons, but they never did. The federal government is now investigating the state on their lack of enforcement of environmental laws in Pohakuloa. And also, the military is now looking into a law allowing them to seize that land in 2029. We can turn to the next one. For years, Hawaiians made up the highest percentage of poverty in the islands. Being evicted after the loss of kingdom, they tried to survive. They had very little money, low-paying jobs, little education with the closing of Hawaiian language schools. If they did have lands, many were forced to leave their lands in search of employment, which was further breakup of the Hawaiian family and the clan unit. There was also something called quiet title. And again, I'll tell a story about my ohana in Maui. My grandparents were ali'i, and they had a huge amount of land on Maui. I believe it was about 30,000 acres in Nu'u, Kaupo, all the way to Hana. And what they would do is they would lease some of the land to Kaupo Ranch for 1 pipi a year. A pipi is a cow. So 1 cow a year, they use the land. My grandmother left there in 1957. So there was nobody to pay the pipi to. So Kaupo Ranch, after a certain amount of years, I think it was 20 years, quiet titled the land. They printed in some obscure paper, anyone who owns this land has to come and claim it. Of course, nobody in the family saw it. So now Kaupo Ranch owns the land. We could sue because we still have the deeds, but nobody in my family has the money to sue. We don't have that kind of money. So we basically lost the land. So today, when we look at Hawaiians, we still have very little knowledge of the Hawaiian language. Less than 30,000 speak Hawaiian. And if by the century's end, we do not have a minimum of 100,000 speakers, the language is probably doomed to extinction. Many Hawaiians have less than an adequate knowledge of standard English also. In education, Hawaiians went from having education being a top priority to, in many families today, no priority. The effect of the attempt to abolish the language, the effect of the closure of Hawaiian language schools was devastating. Now, I would like to talk about lack of employment. This happened in the 1990s. I have a friend, I'm not going to say her name, but she is blonde-haired, no, light brown hair, blue eyes, she's got freckles, very, very white skin. She graduated from a school in Hilo, but she's part Hawaiian. She went to Harvard University, where she got a degree in oceanography. And she applied for jobs in Kona. So she got hired, she went and she shared an office with their personnel director. And one day while she's working, she's watching the personnel director and the letters came in and he would take letters and put it aside and other letters he'd open and read them. And so she looked at it, she says, how come you're not opening those? His response was, those are applications from Hawaii. We don't hire people from Hawaii. That's not just Hawaiians, that's everyone. And in the 1990s, that was a time when people had a hard time finding jobs. A professor at the University of Hawaii did a study about that decade. And in his study, he found that between 200 and 250,000 people, mostly young families and educated local people, left Hawaii. They moved to places like California, Nevada, Arizona, Washington, Oregon. But he also found that in the same decade, 180,000 people, mostly single and white, immigrated to Hawaii. 80% of them had jobs in hand when they got off the plane. There's also a story in the 1990s I read in the Honolulu paper when somebody intercepted a note from a commander at Pearl Harbor and addressed to the commanding admiral about a construction project at Pearl Harbor. They were not going to open this construction project to the people of Hawaii. Instead, they were advertising it to all the different bases in the continental United States. That is bad enough, but the memo ended with that ought to lighten the complexion of this place. The story appeared in the Honolulu papers and it was an outrage. But when the Navy said, oh, it was misunderstood, the papers just dropped it. During that decade, Hawaii lost 200 to 250,000 mostly young, educated families who could not get jobs. But 180,000 people, 80% with jobs at hand, migrated to Hawaii from the US. Was that an attempt to lighten the complexion of this place? Let me move on to the next one. Oh, we are there, okay. Assimilation was always the objective of the United States when dealing with Hawaiians. I remember as a child being told that assimilation was not only good, but was the only way to get ahead. It was just accepted that we would assimilate. Like your standard American. So we would never be real Americans. Hawaiians have to constantly fight to preserve sacred lands. Hawaiians have to constantly fight to preserve the iwi, the bones that are found in the lands being developed. As I mentioned earlier, the seizing of land and the ban of language, the closure of Hawaiian language schools, the forcible assimilation of Hawaiians in the Hawaii school system, including Catholic schools, was rampant. In 1996, I received a phone call from a sister who was a principal at a Catholic school. And she had 2 new Hawaiian students who came from a Hawaiian language school and started in the Catholic school. When they said the Pledge of Allegiance and they sang an American patriotic song, the 2 students refused to stand. The principal wanted to at least suspend them, at most expel them. My response to her was that she could not force them to stand. It is their right. She could expel them, but expect a lawsuit. She left them alone. In the Admissions Act, when we became a state, 20% of all monies generated by the Ceded Land Trust was to go to Native Hawaiians. This has not happened. After the Constitutional Convention of 1978, monies were given to OHA, but today, for years, not much more has been given. And yet Hawaiians are nearly at the bottom of every financial statistic in Hawaii. We can move on now. For years, the US attempted to assimilate the Hawaiian people according to the church. And according to the church and racism, this is ethnocide. Ethnocide is a form of genocide. The eradication of language and customs leads to the death of the people. Therefore, ethnocide, according to the church and racism, is a form of genocide. We, as the Hawaiian people, have progressed, but not nearly enough. Racism, disrespect for the culture, and who we are as a people are still prevalent. I would like to end this talk with the motto of Hawaii, Ua mau ke ea o ka aina ki pono. Um, you know, in Hawaiian songs, poetry, proverbs, there are always two meanings to everything. What happened was Kamehameha III said this after the British ship, well, there was a British ship under the command of Lord George Paulet. He seized the kingdom for Great Britain, took down Hawaiian flags and flew the British flag. 5 months later, Admiral Richard Thomas took down the British flag and rescinds the cession and negotiates a favorable treaty between Britain and Kauikeaʻuli. Admiral Thomas declares Kauikeaʻuli, Kamehameha III, as an independent sovereign, and this was done in what is now called Thomas Square, of course, in 1843. If you don't know where Thomas Square is, it's the park across the street from the Honolulu Art Museum. On the surface, we all know the surface meaning, which Hawaiians, we have what we call the unuhi haiki, which is the surface meaning. And then you have the unuhi laula, which is the wider underneath meaning. Sometimes they call it the kauna, which is actually the true meaning of what it means. So on the surface, the unuhi haiki is the life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. But the unuhi laula, what Kamehameha III really meant, was that if everything is pono, is just, is right for the with the Hawaiian people, Hawaii will live. Conversely, if everything is not well with the Hawaiian people, if they die, Hawaii too will die. I thank you very much for your attention. Mahalo.
Thank you, Father Alapaki, for your wonderful and inspiring presentation. Our Zoom participants will now break into their small groups to come up with some questions for you. Although their small groups are not recorded, the questions and your responses will be part of the video. I would like to welcome back our Zoom participants. And now I would like to ask the leader of Group 1 to share with us the first question that you would like to ask Father Alapaki.
Good afternoon, Father Alapaki. Our group came up with this question: how can we as Christians be allies to best support the Hawaiian people in order to address racism and to reconcile wrongs done so that we can live together in shared lands?
I think what we need to do is we need to educate ourselves on what happened to the Hawaiian people, what's going on with the Hawaiian people. Because if we don't know, we cannot empathize. If we don't know, then we think, well, why? Why are they doing this? And so I think, first of all, we need to educate ourselves. And then we need to find where we could fit in, because everybody's different. Some people would want to do research. Some people would want to protest. Well, not too many protests going on anymore. And other things, you know, so it depends on where the person is and what they want to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would the leader of Group 2 like to ask Father Alapaki a question?
Sure. Aloha mai, Father Alapaki, Christopher Ko'oinoa. Our question is, what is the faith response given what you shared with us today? What can be our faith response?
As Christians, we are called to stand for equal rights in racial issues, in religious issues. We look at our Holy Father and the encyclicals he's made in terms of coming together. The newest one I haven't read it. It's in my printer right now at home, Fratelli Tutti. But apparently, from what I understand, it's more about the acceptance of immigrants, of the poor, being more attuned to the poor, because we are Christians. Jesus tells us that the greatest commandments are to love God and to love one another. And the reason why he says this is, and he also says earlier in a different gospel, that if you say you love God and you hate your neighbor, you're a liar. And why that is because God chose to become human. Therefore, God is God, but God is fully human. And therefore, we must love our brothers and sisters. That's a prerequisite. If we don't love them, we cannot love God. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah. Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Would the leader of group 3 like to ask Father a question?
So thank you again, Father, for your presentation. Our group was wondering if you'd have any insights, maybe in terms of our history of two institutions, the history of St. Louis School, the history of Chaminade University, how that could be reflected on in terms of the history of the Hawaiian people. And then what would that point us to for either a future of how education could be done, or towards a different approach to helping people understand the history of the Hawaiian people?
Well, I think St. Louis and Chaminade have a great opportunity to teach because your educational systems. But the history of St. Louis, I mean, it goes all the way back to the 1800s. I mean, the predecessor to St. Louis had a saint that went to them. Saint Damien was was there. And I was just talking to Brother Dennis while you guys were talking. The Catholic Church itself was always in support of the Hawaiian people. Yeah, there were things that the Catholic Church did, but they were always in support. So we have great saints like Saint Damien and Saint Marianne who dedicated their lives to the people of this land. The original missionaries, the Protestant missionaries, they were good people. They came out here to do good. It was their children and grandchildren that were really bad. So, but Christianity, we try to do things good. We try to love. We try to care, and so if with education, I think if you educate people as to what had happened, there's another elevation of knowledge. And with the elevation of knowledge, that could also point in directions in which people could move.
Thank you.
We have time for one more round of questions. So if the leader of group 1 would like to ask one more question.
So group number 1, again, this is Regina Pfeiffer. So one of the questions we had was, is there or does there exist a contemporary model of Hawaiian community that would allow for the protection and perpetuity of the Hawaiian culture and values?
There are things going on everywhere, like different universities and colleges are doing different things in terms of teaching Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian language. I'm sure Chaminade has a Hawaiian language program. University of Hawaii does. Windward Community College, they have a man there that not only teaches Hawaiian, he teaches culture. So they learn how to make lokoia, they learn how to farm, they learn how to build the hale. And so there are places that are doing this. If it would be nice if we could get more involved into that. But we also have to understand that as a culture, knowing all this is wonderful, but we cannot become stagnant in the past because we don't live in the past. So.
Mahalo, that was a good point because of the contemporary nature of who we are. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Leader of group 2 would like to ask another question.
Thank you, Andrew. Father, what came up in our discussion is talking about Native Hawaiian, non-Native Hawaiian, different races. How do you think we could approach a discussion of racism and being sensitive to it without being so divisive as it comes up about being Native Hawaiian, non-Native Hawaiian, as a response to our faith?
I think, again, it's just an elevation of consciousness level so that people understand where it's coming. That's why when I began the talk, I talked about the 3-meter telescope. And I talked about all the positive things that the 3-meter telescope would do for Hawaii. But I also started talking about why Hawaiians were acting in the way they were. You know, I believe that's kind of non-threatening, but I think that's kind of the way that we need to go. We need to understand where the Hawaiian people are coming from, and we need to understand the history that has put Hawaiians into the position they are in today.
Thank you.
Group 3, would you like to ask another question?
Yes, so in our conversation, we were wondering if you could help us understand or give us some examples of how you integrate your Hawaiian culture and your Catholic faith for yourself, and particularly as a priest in the Catholic Church.
Okay, well, in my parish, we are a very small parish, but we are the largest Native Hawaiian parish in Hawaii, St. Rita Church in Nanakuli. And we have done a lot of enculturation. We've worked, our religious education director is Hawaiian, and she speaks Hawaiian. She also works at the University of Hawaii. We are looking at translating religious education books into the Hawaiian language so we can start offering religious education in the Hawaiian language for those students who go to the Kulakaiaupuni or other Hawaiian language schools. In our parish, I have found different things about our culture that I think that could be integrated into the Mass, enculturated into the Mass. We have completed translating all 4 Eucharistic prayers from the new Roman Missal into Hawaiian. We're working on the collect, the prayer after communion, and the prayer, the presentation of the gifts. We're working on translating those now. We do have, on the first Sunday of the month, all our Masses are bilingual, English and Hawaiian. And it's not just a language thing, it's a cultural thing. I remember when, during Bishop DiLorenzo's time, when Rome came out and said we couldn't dance the hula. That was right when I was transferred to Nanakuli. And when I got there, I said, we were planning the liturgy, my first liturgy, and I said, oh, this would be a great place for the hula. And one of the ladies says, oh, Rome has forbidden it. And my response was, oh no, they mean people that don't know what they're doing. We know what they're doing, what we're doing. And if we're wrong, then Rome can send the hula police come arrest us. And soon later, after, I got a call from somebody from the New York Times because they found out that we were still doing the hula. And after that article was printed, it was within like 2 months that the hula ban was rescinded. Now, the other thing too was Sister Evelyn Wood was the liturgy director for the diocese. And I would keep calling it hula. And she said, oh, you can't call it, Rome says you can't call it that. And my response was, well, you tell me what I should call it. She says, well, how do you say, what is the word they use in English?
Sacred gesture and movement.
Gesture, yes. She says, how do you say sacred gesture in Hawaiian? I go, hula. That's our word for sacred gesture. And so from then on, I used hula, you know. I think I'm going off your question. But we also like tea leaves. Tea leaves in Hawaiian culture are kind of important. Hawaiians usually plant them on the corners of their property to keep out evil spirits. I remember when I was a child, my mother would, if I had a fever, my mother would take a tea leaf and put it on my forehead because they believed it would draw out the fever. And also, when you brought food or lei to someone, you would put it in tea leaves because tea leaves seem to keep them fresh longer. So we've taken all that into our liturgy. And so what we use it now for, the tea leaf, is when people are going to take communion to the homebound. They all come up to the altar. Well, when we don't have the lockdown, they come up to the altar. I wrap it in tea leaves because, first of all, tea leaves are symbolically heal. Tea leaves preserve. Tea leaves was used to carry food. Tea leaves ward off evil spirits. So we wrap them up and they take those out to those who are homebound. And when they're done, they don't throw the leaf in the garbage. They put it back in the garden to go back to the land. So that's how we're bringing in Hawaiian culture. Also in Hawaiian culture, ancestors are important. And our saving grace with that is that in Thailand, ancestors are important. And because ancestors are worshipped in Thailand, Rome has given permission to Thailand for incorporating their beliefs. And so we also have a high regard for our ancestors. And so oftentimes when we pray in Hawaiian, we pray addressing it to God, but also to our ancestors who are with God.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sure there's more I could say, but I think I've talked long enough.
Well, thank you so much, Father Alapaki. Your reflections helped all of us to better appreciate the unique complexities of racism in Hawaii. So why don't we give Father a round of applause virtually. Thank you so much, Father.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again.
Awesome. So if you're not on our mailing list, please be sure to email us at baldschmitz@aol.com. Please watch for ads for future lectures. Our spring lecture will be on Sunday, March 14th, 2021 in the Mystical Rose Oratory on our Chaminade St. Louis campus. Our presenter is Bishop Robert McElroy, the Bishop of the Diocese of San Diego. And now I would like to ask Brother Brandon Alana from St. Louis School to do our closing prayer.
Friends, let us pray. O God, Trinity of love, from the profound communion of your divine life, pour out upon us a torrent of fraternal love. Grant us the love reflected in the actions of Jesus, in his family of Nazareth, and in the early Christian community. Grant that we may live the gospel, discovering Christ in each human person, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned and the forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother and sister who makes a new start. Come, Holy Spirit, and show us your beauty reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. For we make this prayer in the name of your Son, who has called each of us to walk with him as his brothers and sisters, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone. We
Everybody.
look forward to seeing you in person at our next event.